all here this morning. Thanks for accompanying us during this panel on colonial legacies, corporate power, and the struggle for self-determination. My name is Joe Berra. I'm here at UCLA Law School at the Promise Institute for Human Rights and an affiliate faculty member of the Critical Race Studies program. So this panel is going to explore how colonialism, past and present, continues to shape law, democracy, and global power. We'll hear from a number of scholars. Alvin Padilla-Babilonia is Assistant Professor of Law at Villanova University School of Law. MJ Palau McDonald is Assistant Professor of Law at University of Hawaii at Manoa. Natasha Nandlal Variani is Professor of Law at Roger Williams University School of Law. And Leo Yu is Assistant Professor of Law at University of Massachusetts School of Law. I'll introduce each of their paper topics when they present. We're going to step down now so we can use the projection of the slides. And our first presenter will be Alvin Padilla-Babilonia. Alvin, as I mentioned, is Assistant Professor of Law at Charles Widger School of Law at Villanova University. And his scholarship focuses on the constitutional legacy of American colonialism and the relationship between law, race, and empire. Alvin's paper that he's presenting is The Constitutional Politics of Housing and Land Rights. Alvin, please proceed.
Thank you. I think the slides are not on yet. Perfect. I have to remember to change it here in addition to my slides. So if you don't, what I'm saying doesn't go along with like what I see in the slides, please. Well, thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it. So this presentation I'm talking about a paper that I'm still very much working on. It's titled The Constitutional Politics of Housing and Land Rights. Before we begin talking about the paper, I wanted to talk a little bit more about my research agenda. So as Joe mentioned, my research agenda is on the relationship between constitutionalism and colonialism. So I'm from Puerto Rico, so I started to think about these topics from the perspective of Puerto Rico. And in Puerto Rico, kind of like paradoxically, sometimes the ideas of constitutionalism, like citizenship, like constitutional rights, like enumerated powers, sometimes are presented as kind of like as a response to colonialism. In my research, which explores territorial expansion, explores the history of slavery, explores Indian dispossession, explores overseas colonies in the Caribbean and the Pacific, I try to argue, rather than focusing on constitutionalism as a response to colonialism, I argue that really the history of colonialism shows the limits of U.S. constitutionalism. So instead, I try to argue kind of like how we can build a different constitutional culture that really centers more ideas about constitutional politics rather than constitutional law. So basically, one way of thinking about what I'm trying to do, what I say in the papers, is that what I'm proposing is kind of like deconstitutionalizing colonialism through democratic decolonization. And this is a democratic decolonization that centers democratic politics, social movements, and anti-colonial solidarities. In a different paper, I argue that as part of this democratic decolonization agenda, maybe the people of Puerto Rico, people of the other U.S. Territories, and also Native nations and so on, maybe they should be able to resist federal constitutional rights, including a colorblind interpretation of the equal protection clause. And those kind of like ideas is the one that I want to develop in this paper concerning the constitutional politics of housing and land rights. So in this paper, basically my main focus is race-conscious remedies designed to address the inequities in access to housing and land rights for racial minorities, Native nations, and the U.S. territories. So kind of like current constitutional law divides the approaches to these issues from the perspective of access to housing of racial minorities is more to an anti-discrimination framework. Meanwhile, for Native nations and the territories, at least up to this point, federal courts have been more willing to think about these issues from a self-determination framework. In the paper, I'm going to be, in the presentation, I'm going to be kind of like mapping these different groups. But I'm also going to be talking about how we should kind of like move past these doctrinal silos from the idea of like race and the law, federal Indian law, and law of U.S. territories, and try to think of these issues kind of like together. And one particular reason for thinking about these issues together is that the U.S. Supreme Court today seems to be approaching these issues from a perspective of constitutional uniformity, but it seems to be that rather than expanding the notion of self-determination to racial minorities in the states, instead the court is thinking about these issues from the perspective of like any form of racial classification, even if it is to address inequities that are the product of the legacy of colonialism. There are racial classifications that won't be subject to a strict scrutiny, right? So it seems like the Supreme Court is moving toward a shift of just requiring strict scrutiny for all these race-conscious remedies address inequities in housing and land rights. So in part 2 of the paper, I'm going to be talking about like kind of like some of the proposals to address this current constitutional law. But then in my more normative part of the paper, what I'm going to try to do is rather than focusing on court-centered solutions or on Congress, we should really be building more kind of like constitutional politics of land rights and housing. So I'm going to be talking about that. So the structure of the paper and the structure of the presentation is like, first I'm going to focus on like constitutional law, right? So mapping all these categories. Second, how constitutional theory informs some of these debates. And finally, constitutional politics or praxis in order to think about how to really address these sort of issues from below. Okay, just realizing that this is going to be a lot of clicks right now. Okay, so for mapping, this is the one that maybe we're more familiar with, right? So like with respects to racial classifications, the Supreme Court has said that they won't be subjected to strict scrutiny, right? In this case, Virginia is a law that forbade interracial marriage, right? So even within that case, you see perspective from both kind of like an anti-classification principle and an anti-subordination principle. But at this point, the main thing is to just say that in regards to like racial classifications, federal courts apply strict scrutiny. Now, with regards to Native nations, with regards to Indian tribes, the Supreme Court has said that if there is a preference, in this case an employment preference for members of Indian tribes, federally recognized Indian tribes, those policies are going to be evaluated as a political classification rather than a racial classification, and courts apply a more differential level of review. Now, with regards to indigenous peoples in the states that are not part of a federally recognized Indian tribe, the Supreme Court in Rice v. Cayetano said that there actually should be considered more like a racial classification, right? That case concerned the 15th Amendment, not the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, but now this case is being cited in cases like Student for Fair Admissions versus Harvard for the proposition, right, that this form of policies contain a racial classification that must be subject under strict scrutiny. Finally, and this is maybe the one that we're maybe least familiarized with, is the perspective from Puerto Rico. So early on in the insular cases, instead of decisions decided in the early 20th century, the Supreme Court said that Puerto Rico was an unincorporated territory of the United States. That meant that at the time, the full Bill of Rights was not going to apply in Puerto Rico, only those provisions that were considered to be fundamental. That was an approach that the Supreme Court was developing for the U.S. states at the same time in the incorporation doctrine. But the main idea here, for our purposes, is that through this doctrine, it seems like there might be some more room to protect certain local customs of these territories, because the idea is that the Supreme Court is saying like, we should not kind of like extend the entire Constitution because they have their own forms of government, they have their own customs, law, language, so we only should apply those laws that are considered to be fundamental. Now, when we get to the topic of land rights and housing, we see that this mapping that the Supreme Court has developed has consequences for what it means for land rights and housing policy. So, with regards to race, the Supreme Court has said that only those forms of like only those policies that include a discriminatory purpose or a discriminatory intent are going to be evaluated under strict scrutiny, right? So that means that policies that might have a disparate impact are not evaluated under constitutional law under a higher level of review. Now, there are disparate impact provisions under the Fair Housing Act, for example, that have been used historically to address inequities in housing. I'm going to mention in the next slide how even some of those policies, even though they might not be include a racial classification, because they're considered to be kind of like a race-conscious remedy, now they're also being challenged as well. With regards to Native nations, these sort of classifications or mapping has meant that federal policies can have provisions with regards to like land that you would think that are classifying people on the basis of race, but again, federal courts are more differential with regards to these sort of policies. And then finally, with regards to the U.S. territories, in this case the territory of the Northern Mariana Islands, federal courts, in this case the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, have said that because the Northern Mariana Islands is an unincorporated territory, not all of the, let's say, guarantees of the Constitution will apply exactly the same way in the territories that they apply in the state. So in this case, it concerns a prohibition, land alienation restriction with regards to like the land that is considered to be more like communal or owned collectively in the Northern Mariana Islands, and the way that the Covenant of the Northern Mariana Islands provided for this land alienation restriction was to really a racial classification. But the court is basically saying like, no, we're not going to apply strict scrutiny to this type of policy, because it would be to kind of like the Bill of Rights should not be interpreted as a genocide pact for diverse cultures, right? So to this understanding, the courts are more willing to be kind of like deferential to some of these race-conscious remedies to address land rights and so on. Now, with regards to the present moment that we're in, basically there have been like 3 Supreme Court decisions in the past couple of years that really communicate like the end of race-conscious and empire-conscious policies, right? So again, Harvard is a case that we have heard about a lot this past couple of days, right? And in that case, basically the Supreme Court not only applies strict scrutiny, but basically it's going to be really hard to find a compelling interest that might mean that this policy will survive strict scrutiny. And even though at this moment it seems like maybe policies with regards to like Native nations and territories are still safe within our constitutional law, in these 2 cases, members of the Supreme Court communicated in concurrent opinions that maybe those sort of policies should also be evaluated under a higher level of review or should be evaluated differently. Right? So in the 13th case, Justice Kavanaugh said these type of policies, maybe there could be equal protection issues, right, with regards to policies that favor Native nations. With regards to the territories, Justice Gorsuch has said that the way that the Constitution applies in the territory should not be based on the insular cases, it should be based on the Constitution's text, history, and national practice, right, so this history and tradition standard. And he's basically saying like, whether a particular policy survives should not be based on how a federal court evaluates the local customs of that territory. It should be based on the Constitution, right? So again, this is kind of like, he doesn't talk about it in a colorblind perspective, right? But you can really read between the lines that he's basically saying like some of these, how these sort of cases were used as a framework for protecting certain cultural accommodations. And now he seems to say like that can no longer be the framework, it needs to be one consistent with the text and history of the Constitution. So now briefly with regards to like kind of like my proposal with regards to this, right? So in the paper I want to talk about some of the limitations of like court-centered solutions, right? So a court-centered solution could be, we should kind of like double down on these distinctions, right? It should be like, well, maybe race-conscious remedies are not constitutional with regards to racial minorities in the states, but maybe they might still survive strict judicial scrutiny with regards to like Native nations for the territories. Another judicial approach would be to say like we need to find a better historical understanding of the 14th Amendment to argue why these sort of policies might survive judicial review. Another one would be we'll need to maybe think about equal protection differently. Maybe we should go back to the anti-subordination principle. I believe that all these strategies are, well, first, very likely they're not going to prevail at the Supreme Court right now. But more important than that, I think those strategies tend to kind of like depoliticize these issues, and they kind of like preserve this distinction between anti-discrimination and self-determination. They preserve this distinction between racial minorities in the states and these other areas that are the product of colonialism. And my argument is that this type of bifurcation basically erases the colonial dimension of slavery and also erases the racialized nature of colonial expansion as well. So instead, in my proposal, I argue that there should be kind of like a constitutional politics of housing and land rights. These constitutional politics should really center the idea of like anti-colonial solidarities. By this I mean anti-colonialism as something that maybe can bridge race and empire, right? Something that we can talk about these issues kind of like collectively. As part of this concept, also the idea of like solidarities across racialized and colonized communities, and kind of like avoiding the zero-sum game of constitutional law, right? Where sometimes in order to be able to have, let's say, a federal law that benefits Native nations, the argument is like, no, like Native nations have tribal sovereignty, they have inherent sovereignty, right? And that those types of arguments sometimes can exclude, for example, the territories where the federal courts have not recognized a tribal and inherent sovereignty. So I argue that from the perspective of solidarities, we should resist the zero-sum game of constitutional law, and also from the perspective of anti-colonial solidarities, I argue that this type of constitutional politics, maybe if we kind of like center anti-colonialism, maybe constitutional laws, as currently understood, should not be the main vocabulary to make claims, and maybe we should use anti-colonialism to kind of like unsettle how important kind of like constitutionalism is in the United States for the types of claims that we can even make. With regards to social movements, there's a lot of literature with regards to like social movements, right? But that literature in the late 90s and early 21st century really focused on kind of like how social movements could change constitutional law, right? And here I take a different approach, right? I would argue that some of these social movements in the land rights and access to housing context, they might not be speaking in a constitutional register. They might not be arguing that the equal protection clause should be interpreted differently. Maybe they're not even making constitutional arguments, right? And that should be part of the constitutional politics that I'm developing here. And also, I think social movements should be important for being able to really resist federal constitutional rights, in this case, a colorblind interpretation of the equal protection clause. So I'm arguing in the part of like democratic politics that, again, the democratic politics and institutional transformation are necessary, and maybe sometimes cities, states, territories, tribal councils, maybe they should be able to enact policies that include sometimes race-conscious remedies in order to resist, in order to contest these traditional understandings of race and colonialism. Just to kind of like end, basically in the paper, I also want to like not only do kind of like a mapping and not only argue for this division of constitutional politics, but I also want to include a kind of like a set of policies that maybe could be enacted by territories, cities, states in order to address these issues, and rather than to divide them as the policies that should be enacted by Native nations or by territories and so on, I think of it like as a menu of options that all these racialized and colonized communities should be thinking about when enacting policies to address the inequities of land rights and housing. So thank you so much for being here, and I welcome any comments and suggestions.
Thank you. We're going to move through the different presentations and then open it up for discussion. Please keep track of your questions for the presenters. I think they're all very interested in hearing both questions and comments so that they can continue to work on their research and papers. Let's do this efficiently. Yours is on the drive, right?
Yes.
Okay. This is it, right?
briefly introduce you.
Big relief, we're there.
Well, our next speaker is MJ McDonald. She's assistant professor at the School of Law, assistant professor of law at the University of Hawaii at Manoa School of Law. And MJ, her areas of scholarship and research include Native Hawaiian law, critical contextual inquiry, legal history, and restorative environmental justice for indigenous peoples. And she will be speaking on her paper, Portraits of Sedition and Savagery. Thank you, MJ.
Yeah, hi everyone, thanks for coming. I am going to present on my work in progress, Portraits of Sedition and Savagery, which looks at two American missionary-led initiatives to ban the Hawaiian and Japanese languages during the late 1800s and early 1900s. I use these initiatives to examine how, at least this is what I think I'm trying to do, to examine how language is used as a proxy for race in these missionaries' attempts to legitimate their usurpation of the Hawaiian kingdom and cement their gridlock over economic, social, and political power, basically every facet of society in Hawaii at the time. So a quick roadmap. I am first going to set forth a theoretical framework that yokes together Omi and Wynot's theory of racial formation with Albert Memmi's analysis of the racist attitude. And in my paper, I try to show how these are actually getting kind of at the same phenomenon, even though they were articulated like decades apart. Then I apply the framework to the language eradication initiatives to demonstrate how attacks on the language were used as a proxy for race in this colonial situation. And then finally, at the end of the presentation, I have some questions for you folks to think about that I would love thoughts on at the end during the Q&A portion. So first, the theoretical framework. So yes, I'm also doing the slides here and slides there, so if it gets disjointed, let me know. So I'm guessing everyone here is pretty down with the social construction of race, so, and probably folks are also very familiar with racial formation. But just so we're all on the same page, right, Omi and Wynot describe racial formation as the socio-historical process by which racial categories are created, inhabited, transformed, and destroyed. So in this process, we are imbuing cultural practices, characteristics with racial meaning, and then deploying that meaning to justify differential treatment. So hold that thought, because it sounds strikingly similar to Albert Memmi's analysis of the racist attitude. Okay, is anyone here familiar with Albert Memmi? No. Okay, and no one ever is, which is always wild to me. So he is one of a group of post-colonial scholars, so he is often the most forgotten of them. He is a really interesting figure. He was Tunisian and Jewish, and grew up during France's colonial occupation of North Africa. And whereas his contemporaries, such as Franz Fanon, might view colonialism as systems or structures in a Marxist analysis, in his seminal work, The Colonizer and the Colonized, he sought to identify and conceptualize colonialism as portraits of human intentions and relationships. So his whole theory, like you could say it's Marxist, but he's articulating it in relationships between people. And one scholar wrote that, like all the intellectual figures of the anti-colonial struggle, from Franz Fanon to Edward Said and many others, Memmi belonged to a generation whose thoughts sprang from a body subjected daily to repeated, ongoing oppression and the fractured identity specific to the experience of colonized subjects. Memmi's work in particular deals with racial liminality, and he used his own experience to map a colonial power stratification. So on his mother's side, it's kind of hard to see, but he was indigenous, part of the colonized. He was indigenous North African. And on his father's side, he was Jewish, so he was a candidate for assimilation. And he also won attendance. He was like really, really smart, and he won attendance to a very elite school in Tunisia. So he also like rubbed elbows with the colonized. And all of this reinforced his like liminal or fractured identity that really comes through in all of his theoretical works. And on a personal level, as a white passing indigenous person, I really identify with the liminality in his work. caveat though, if any of you go and look up Memi after this, he does take kind of a really unfortunate turn in his later years, and cannot apply his analysis to other situations and becomes a staunch Zionist. So I am in no way condoning that, but I do think he's a very complicated figure, and I find him very fascinating, and I think his earlier works are really, really important for colonial situations today. But just wanted to give that caveat. And I think that this colonial stratification maps really well on Hawaii's situation historically and today, but that is another paper entirely. But I think it's useful to kind of see his identity and how he was operating with his theory. So for now though, the framework that looks a lot like Omi and Reynolds' racial formation theory is Memi's analysis of the racial attitude, which is also described as discursive techniques. So through Memi's schooling, right, he spent a long time with the colonizer, with these like, elite French students, and he identified what he called the analysis of the racist attitude, and he's using racist in a colonial term, so I think it's helpful to think about like his worldview. He was not, I think later in his life he was in the US, but he was talking about the French occupation of North Africa at the time, and that's what he's calling racism, which it is racism, but it has this colonial flavor to it. And the analysis of the racist attitude are four discursive techniques used by the colonizer in racist imperial discourse to justify privileges over or aggressions toward the colonized and other groups in that colonial strata. So the first step is stressing the real or imaginary differences between the colonizer and the colonized. So like picking something like, for example, attendance at a Japanese language school, or different hairstyle, or different religious practices, whatever it is, and stressing those real or imagined differences. And then there's assigning values to those differences to the advantage of the colonizer and the detriment of the colonized. Then trying to make them absolutes by generalizing from them. So, you know, all people that attend a Japanese language school are bad, or all people that speak below the Hawaiian language are savage. And claiming that those differences are final. And then you use these stereotypes to justify any present or possible aggression or privilege. So it kind of sounds familiar, right? It's strikingly similar to the racial formation process identified by Omi and Reynolds, wherein you're imbuing physical and cultural characteristics with racial meaning. But Memi's is particularized to the colonial situation, and he also used it in particular to describe like the media and the aesthetics of empire in a way that I'm not sure Omi and Reynolds' racial formation really targeted. So like, that's why I think Memi is particularly useful in the situation that I'm going to talk about in the next slide. So, with that very summarized framework, I'm now going to turn to the language eradication initiatives in Hawaii. So, really quickly, because folks are often not familiar with Hawaii history, here's an exceptionally brief primer. Prior to Western contact, Kanaka Oiwi, Native Hawaiian communities thrived in a complex society rooted in reciprocal relationships between ourselves and our biocultural resources in the most isolated archipelago in the world. And it actually supported a population close to present day size. But the arrival of missionaries in Hawaii in the 1820s profoundly altered every aspect of Hawaiian society, ultimately ending in mass death of our people, widespread land dispossession, cultural devastation, environmental destruction, and the illegal overthrow of the Kingdom of Hawaii. Which, by the way, was a constitutional monarchy at the time, so we weren't just like, you know, ungoverned, we were a literal constitutional monarchy. So you can kind of think of the illegal overthrow of our kingdom being akin to like, if Trump like actually got his wish and was able to like unilaterally annex another country. But again, that's like another conversation entirely. One interesting thing about the missionaries, they committed to learning Olelo Hawaii, and they're actually credited with reducing what was an oral language, our oral language, to a written one. So as you'll see in coming slides, they are responsible for trying to eradicate it, but they also are responsible for why we have such gigantic voluminous written records. Okay, but in less than 100 years of their arrival, the missionaries had founded, well, there were 5 companies known as the Big Five that took control of Hawaii's economy, politics, social life, religious life, and they remade the islands into a plantation society, and 4 of those companies were founded by missionary families. The missionaries turned capitalists, eventually overthrew our sovereign kingdom, and stole vast swaths of land from the government and our queen, and they established their own republic. One of the key architects of the coup was Lauren Thurston, who was the grandson of Asa and Lucy. From this slide, I've done way too much research into these missionaries, and I have fun stories about Lucy if anyone ever wants to hear them. That's another conversation. So this is their grandson, Lauren, and he becomes kind of public enemy #1 for Hawaiians even to this day. He was born in Hawaii. He was fluent in the Hawaiian language, and he was a politician, businessman, and lawyer. But one of the early things that the missionaries did, led by Lauren Thurston, once they had overthrown the kingdom and created their own republic, was they banned Oloa Hawaii, the Hawaiian language. They justified this by saying that it was a dead language, and they had over the last 60 or so years made English the language of power in the islands, right? Laws were codified in both Hawaiian and English, and there are a bunch of cases where folks are duking it out over which translation of the law controls if there are differences. And it makes sense, right, that colonized peoples want their children to learn the language of empire so they can have opportunities. But under the Republic, the missionary descendants banned the Hawaiian language on the basis that it was a dead language and it was relegated to like a savage pagan past. And this, I think is really consistent with how they viewed all Hawaiians at the time, as if we were a dying race who were all but wiped out. And I think that banning the language was necessary in their project of casting themselves as like the natural, inevitable inheritors or heirs of Hawaii. And there's a Hawaiian scholar named Maile Arvin, who has done a lot of work looking at their kind of newspapers and imagery and how they were really viewing themselves as the natural inheritors of Hawaii, that we were almost white, and thus we were in this kind of Greco-Roman tradition, and thus white Americans are the natural inheritors of this paradise that they have saved. So the Republican government, after the overthrow, immediately tried to have the U.S. annex Hawaii, but due to overwhelming Native Hawaiian organizing and fears in the U.S. about the large non-white populations in Hawaii, they were not successful. And just as an aside, we've talked a lot about the power of organizing over the few days of this conference, and 98% of the Hawaiian population at the time signed the Ku'e petitions against annexation. And these petitions were delivered to the U.S. federal government, and this is actually one of the petitions that one of my ancestors actually signed, which is kind of cool. So Hawaiians were successful for a bit in staving off annexation, but the pro-annexation movement garnered renewed support in 1897 through spring 1898 due to the Spanish-American War, among other factors. And our dear friend Lauren Thurston, who was at this point the Minister of Foreign Affairs for the Republic of Hawaii and a staunch pro-annexationist, he deployed racial tropes against the Japanese populations in Hawaii that had been brewing in like the broader U.S. geopolitical milieu against the growing Japanese population. He's doing this to support, to garner support for annexation. And he, in this period, starts targeting Japanese language schools as like hotbeds of seditious activity. So it's this weird marriage of like, I need to target these people on the basis of, he's doing it on the basis of race, but he's using language as this proxy in the language schools for that reason. Thank you. And other missionary descendants, they jump on this bandwagon and are calling for the eradication of the language schools. And so you might be wondering what was going on with the language schools at this time. So like I said, missionaries and their planter descendants had controlled all aspects of Hawaii society, including the sugar plantations. And the plantations had imported contract laborers from Japan. And initially these laborers viewed themselves as sojourners who would return, to Japan once their contracts were over, but plantations had incentivized them to stay, and they were ultimately successful. So as the laborers set down roots and had children, Japanese language schools were created, both as a way to teach the children the language, culture, civic education of Japan, but also as child care centers for parents who were working for plantations and needed a place for their kids to go after the public school day had ended. But white American legislators who were also missionary descendants, it's like all the same guys, became increasingly worried that the growing Japanese population would gain electoral control and began to attack the Japanese language schools. This is even after Warren had started this, like 20 years later, they're attacking them again, keying into the Americanization movement and nativist fervor that was sweeping the continental United States at the time. So in this way, I argue that the territory's anti-Japanese movement was distinct from the concurrent Japanese exclusion initiatives in California and Washington, which revolved around attempts to prevent Japanese land ownership and economic ascension, though the fear of the yellow peril was the fulcrum around which all of these things metastasized. So it was the same underlying currents but slightly distinct interests. So that was a lot of history, and so I'm just going to visually show you what I basically just said. So I essentially am trying to distill 3 missionary-led pushes to eradicate language as a tool of legitimating and then furthering colonial domination. So first, the overthrow is linked with this ban of the Hawaiian language. And then the push for U.S. annexation is coupled with Thurston's fear-mongering about the foreign threat from within Hawaii, and this is the initial wave of targeting Japanese language schools, even before the Americanization movement had really garnered steam and come into full force in the continental United States. And then, finally, the banning of the Japanese language schools in order to Americanize, we say, the children of Japanese immigrants who, unlike their parents, had voting rights, and they were nearly half of the territory's population at the time that this happened. Okay. So finally, my questions, if there's time during the Q&A portion. I'm really struggling to figure out how this is relevant to today. I've been encouraged by senior colleagues to try to find some hook to say why this is important today, so I can publish this in a law review. So that's one question, if anyone has thoughts. I think there's a myriad ways to go with it, and I lose the forest for the trees, I think, with this. And then, similar to my losing the forest for the trees, I'm struggling through this conceptual linkage of language, race, and empire making. So if folks have sources or thoughts, I would love that. So thank you all so much.
Thank you, MJ. Our next speaker is Natasha Variani, and Natasha is a professor at Roger Williams University School of Law. She has extensive background in private practice in complex tax planning and litigation, and her scholarly research, however, has focused on understanding systemic racism through the lens of property law and gender perspectives in the law. So welcome, Natasha, and I will get your presentation on.
I'm going to sit up here if that's okay, because I want to have like a sit down. I want to have a sit down conversation. And I want to start by saying thank you for coming, because this is a Saturday morning panel, and looking at the concurrent panels, you have some really good options, and so I'm really grateful for you being here this morning. So I'm going to start with some gratitude for you being here, and I hope that you are enjoying this few days as much as I am. I am going to talk about something that I am working on that is partly a paper, but partly also sort of a program that I'm working on. And here on my title slide, I've put some images of a tea plant and some tea, because there are some things. I love a good metaphor, right? And I have, over the past couple of days, been reminded about how much more compelling, how much I can hear things when I can connect it to sort of the personal stories of the presenters. So I'm going to also shout out my friend Champoli here, who has reminded me and sort of, I've had sort of a wonderful time connecting with you personally. So shout out and also apologies for maybe repeating some of the things that I've said to you, but reminded me how important it is to sort of bring my personal story to my work. And so I'm going to tell you that growing up, tea has been such an important part of sort of how I've connected with people, my family. It's an important part of my culture. We call it chai, right? But not like chai that they sell at Starbucks. Like this is an important part of who we are. But I also really love the metaphor of sort of how it is something that comes from the ground. It's also something that's been really connected to colonialism. It's been sort of co-opted. There's sort of English tea that is a whole different kind of thing. And it's one of those things that for me, in a scholarly way, has been really important. It's connected. I'm a tax person. And so, you know, and I live in Boston, so the Boston Tea Party is kind of a thing for me, because that was also about tax. So there are all these things about tea that really resonate with me personally, because so many of my relationships have been formed over this sort of warm beverage that sort of is grown from the soil of people who have put their hands in the soil, but a lot has to happen for it to get there. So I think that for me, a lot of these projects are the same way. The soil is really important for the flavor, but a lot has to happen for it to get to sort of the final stage of where it is. So that's sort of where I wanted to sort of share with you, and you'll see that come through. I also I'd be remiss if I didn't thank Professor Vera for your work and support in this. So that's a long way to go for me to get to the beginning. So I want to start by thinking about my work has to do with what I'm calling corporate colonialism, what we are calling corporate colonialism, because this is a collaborative project. You already know what I mean by colonialism if you are sitting in this room. But two things two refrains that I sort of constantly say in my work are that words matter, because they do. For everyone in the world, I have small children and I consistently tell them that words matter, but we are attorneys, so words especially matter and precision matters. The second thing I'll say that's also important for this project, my second refrain, is that relationships are everything. And that is another thing that I sort of keep coming back to in my work and my life. So in really broad strokes, when I think about colonialism, and my partner in this project, who you will hear more about in a few minutes, when I think about defining colonialism, and I really liked hearing about it sort of as portraits that really resonated with me. Yesterday we heard a little bit about sort of how colonialism is not a set of events, but systems and structures, which is a more traditional way of thinking about it. I am thinking about colonialism as an extraction of resources, systems that extract resources. There is an unbalanced power dynamic and an imposition of culture. So when we are thinking about colonialism, there is, whether it is by language or by sort of ways of acting or dressing or a sort of myriad ways. And when we are thinking about corporate colonialism, the general sort of nugget, the thesis is that even though it doesn't happen anymore by way of governments, we are continuing these practices just by way of large multinational corporations, right? So it may be that corporate policies or culture is the way by which we impose these cultures. So we have this sort of feeling in sort of the way that we tell our stories, the way we tell our history in some ways, that this colonial period in our world is over because governments are no longer engaged in this practice. And that, for some people it worked well for a while, and then we realized that it was wrong, right? We realized that it was not the right thing to do, so we stopped. that's sort of the story we tell ourselves, but we are all critical thinkers here. And so we know, though, that even given viewing our sort of world history through the lens of the most sort of positive light that we can, that like we realized how wrong colonialism was and then we stopped. Even if we view it through that lens, which is generous, it's undeniable that the way we are shaped today is because of a lot of how those colonial powers have just left. And a lot of what I've been talking to my own personal story is really deeply shaped by colonialism. My own sort of lack of ever being able to feel like I belong is because of borders that were arbitrarily drawn by people who had no understanding of the cultures of people that were actually living in those spaces. My family is from a place that was India and now is Pakistan, and so I'm all kinds of culturally confused. And so I have a very personal story that is that I bring to this work as well. And so I think in this I want to sort of consider how we tell these stories. And we were just I was just talking over breakfast about sort of the ways that I have 3 small children, and we talk about sort of the ways that colonialism has left us. And sometimes my children, and I teach a cultural class on the weekends to a bunch of first graders, and we talk a little bit about, well, why did it take India so long to become independent, right? When the United States was able to gain their independence way back in 1776, why did it take India until 1947 to get their independence? And we have this difficult conversation where I tell them, well, in India, the English left. And in the United States, the indigenous people were not able to throw off the colonizers. And it really sort of makes even first graders think differently. And so thinking about sort of the lens through which we tell these stories is really important and can help us to think about sort of what is still happening today. So maybe the governments didn't leave, but the truth is that the economic opportunities have remained constant. Whether or not the government is in the United States or in India, economic opportunities have always remained. And so I know from experience that sometimes it can be difficult. Sometimes there's not a lot of intersection in critical theorists and sort of very technical corporate lawyers. But I'm one of those people, and I think for me it's really important to sort of think really deeply and technically and critically about why corporate law is the way it is, right? Why it is structured the way it is structured, who benefits, who advantages, and what we can do about it. And I don't often get a lot of really social justice-minded people that come to me to take my corporate law class, but I often, when they come out the other end, they are a little bit more that way, which is really important to me. So there's always been a partnership between corporate entities and governments, right? And so I really, for me, I want to make that really clear when I teach corporate law, and I want to make that clear in this project. And so we've been talking a lot over the past few days about history and stories, and we certainly have a history, certainly in South Asia, of the East India Tea Company, or the East India Company, and we can look to this. There are no shortage of examples of the ways in which governments have worked together with private entities And given, we can look to sort of the ways that these entities have structured their management. They have been given opportunities to manage the workforce. They have been, in the law, given limits in liability for their investors. And so this is really important because when they make profits, they were giving revenues to the crown. And that, for me, is enough. That's enough of a connection, of enough evidence of a connection of that public-private partnership. So when you are, creating a set of laws, creating a doctrine that is protecting, passive investors, and then giving revenue to a state or a state government, that is something that we should be thinking that's a conflict. So when I teach this class in corporate law, when we are thinking about in the we don't always talk about the East India Company, but we do sort of think a lot about sort of the way that corporate law, particularly in the United States, has evolved. Here in the United States, we have had a lot of evolution. We were a common law system as well. And it used to be at the beginning of our corporate law that we needed sort of these legislative charters. Our states were started as charters, and a lot of our public institutions started with these legislative charters, and then incorporating got a lot easier. But the sort of protections, there were sort of this nobility class and this clergy class really wanted to be able to get in on investing without suffering the risk, the liability, and without really getting their hands dirty in the business. So they protected themselves with this doctrine, with this doctrine that has evolved into our corporate law. So really teaching this set of rules with that lens is really important to me. And I'm hopeful that it makes it stick for the students a little bit, and helps them to understand that when we are dealing with understanding the rise of the mega corporations, sort of when we're dealing with defining the stakeholders as they exist today, they can understand why that history is important. So, so if we remember sort of these tenets of colonialism that we defined earlier, the heart of this paper is really marching through sort of these different stakeholders of the corporation. And as I teach corporate law, I really want to inspect the protections that exist for these different stakeholders, and ask why they exist and what we can do about them, and understand sort of why there is discretion built into some of these standards and who that discretion protects. And really we see over and over and over and over again that these are protections for people in position of power. And if we map sort of race on them, it turns out exactly how you think it's going to. So I want to say that I do have a partner. I've been working with someone at Jindal Global Law School in India. Her name is Malvika Seth. She and I began talking about this some years ago, and I'm a corporate person. She is someone who works in international human rights. And we were talking about this, and she let me talk for about half an hour before she said, "That's great. I've been teaching this class for 10 years. And then I was sort of reminded of my privilege and American exceptionalism in that moment, before she sort of very kindly offered to collaborate. And so in the spring I'm going to Jindal, and we're teaching this course, and we're splitting it. I will be sort of taking the sort of corporate law perspective, and Professor Seth Malvika will be teaching sort of the human rights perspective, because this is a really important thing. We want to sort of train a set of lawyers who has an ability to sort of understand both the doctrine and who are ready and interested in this area. So Malvika, Professor Seth has been teaching this through case studies, right? So she has chosen 4 industries that she thinks and in her experience, students are interested in. And so we, in the second half of the course, will be inspecting different industries. So looking at sort of the supply chains, sort of their customer base, some of their labor practices, and understanding sort of what the actual practical impact is and how attorneys, either with corporate backgrounds or with human rights backgrounds or both, can sort of, now having named this problem, what we can do about it. So for me, thinking about this, here's the relationships are everything part of this. I am sort of really interested in creating cohorts of students who are well-versed in corporate law, who are social justice minded, and that can have lasting relationships, that can have, that are across borders and can have relationships that they know they can turn to when they are seeking to give voice to the voiceless. When they say, hey, I have this problem where I have a set of workers and I need to do something about it. There's a group that needs help. Can you help me? And so I want to, I think over time, if we continue to have this partnership and sort of work on this program, I'm hopeful that we can strengthen that cohort with an alumni network of people that can do this. And I really want to just first start by naming this problem and working on sort of advocacy and policy and doing something about it, and sort of keeping with this theme of thinking about it, teaching around it, so that we can eventually learn to transform the landscape in keeping with the theme of the conference. So I welcome thoughts, particularly from people who have experience in building law school programs or about belonging, and couldn't resist a last T metaphor, which transforms in its many different lives. That's what I've got.
Thank you, Natalia. Thank you. Our next and final presenter will be Leo Yu. Leo practices as a civil rights attorney, litigating complex constitutional cases related to immigrant rights, public nuisance, and land use law. He's an assistant professor at the University of Massachusetts School of Law. His paper will be on racialized allegiances, and the scholarship explores critical legal studies, race in the law, constitutional law, and Asian American legal studies. So thanks Leo, and I'll put your presentation up. Sorry. Apologies here. Got it here somewhere. Oh, no, here it is. Shows it here. There we go. There we go.
Hi, so my paper is a project that is very early, and it's about the definition of multiracial democracy. So that is what have always been curious as a CRT scholar. I think multiracial democracy is something that we say, but nobody really ever clearly define that, it became always like the chapter 4 of your paper, saying that what the goal is multiracial democracy. I think that generally speaking, I think scholars' ideology about multiracial democracy is that at the first we have a hurdle of the law, election law particularly, that was badly interpreted by the Supreme Court, becoming a hurdle of people of color to participate in the American democracy. But then, at least when that hurdle is cleared, at least on the, say, liberal universe of America would have open arms to people of color to participate in the American democracy. Then the election happened, and what happened in Michigan triggers me about writing something about multiracial democracy, because Muslim American in Michigan participated democracy in an old-fashioned way, which is that they told the politician what they want, and the politician basically pretended to be deaf, and then they just walked away, right? And then their walked away triggered a wave of backslash, particularly from the liberal side, accusing them to be the bad actor of democracy. And no liberals have ever written a New York Times op-ed saying that Muslims in Michigan actually practice politics in the right way, right? Although they practice the most traditional way. So my argument, generally speaking, is that for people of color, particularly those who have an immigrant background, the participation of the American democracy has a condition. The condition is to endorse American imperialism. Without that condition, there is no welcome. So the basic framework of my project is going to be a mix of LPE and a CRT. And the contribution is I wanted to really have a platform, a paper to tell people that the entire idea about equality, about democracy, from the beginning, it has to be a global and an international project. It cannot be a two-sided system that we are just championing equal rights while we have a black forest system going on outside America. So I start to analyze the legal history of this federal law that used to be known to few. It's called Foreign Agent Registration Act, right? So it's called FARA. So FARA was enacted in 1938. Right before World War II, and the overall, the congressional intent to enact FARA was a concern of the spread out of Nazism. The Nazi Party in Germany was getting very popular, and their influence was actually getting into America, and that was the stated congressional intent to deter the spread of Nazism. And the law was written as many federal law in a vague way, right? Any individual in America who collaborate and who was trying to work in advance of a foreign interest, the foreign interest can be a sovereignty, can be a foreign political party, then you will be considered as a foreign agent, and that person needs to be registered with the Fed, otherwise there will be criminal or civil penalties, or sometimes both. And the person doesn't have to be a paid employee of that political party or some formal contract either. The fact that you are considered to work towards the interest of that foreign party or sovereign is enough to say that you are a foreign agent that needs to be registered. But the problem is that if you look at the enforcement history of FARA, Nazism was never really the focus of the enforcement. And the enforcement was marginally, and it picked up actually after World War II, during the Civil Rights Movement. And the targets of FARA was black people, particularly those influential black people who really work with the social justice and equality, anti-racist initiative in South Africa. And many famous black activists during that period of time, like W. Du Bois or McCone X, were targeted under FARA, was actually indicted under FARA. And the argument is that not only were they collaborating with probably South African government, and they were also socialists. That's another political agenda during that period of time. During the Civil Rights era, that was targeted. And then you look at how the law is enforced today, and there is a clear trend, shall I speak, of FARA's enforcement. Biden administration, that's another era where FARA's enforcement get picked up. And when you look at the enforcement trend during the Biden administration, the target was Chinese people. And how did that become a thing? Well, there is a history about it, because in the first Trump regime, we had China Initiative. China Initiative was created to deter China by the hands of DOJ, and nobody knew what that means. And eventually it turned out that, oh, we're gonna just look really hard into Chinese professors working in science in America. And it became a huge racial profiling tool. But then it comes to Biden. Biden's DOJ refused to denounce China Initiative as a racial profiling tool, but instead continued that trend of enforcement against Chinese people under the realm of FARA. And then in today's America, FARA is now used to target people who would resonate with the Free Palestine movement. Many scholars and activists are now targeted under FARA, and FARA being accused of being the agent of some foreign influence or Hamas in general. So there's definitely so that's on the people of color side, but there is another side that FARA never really cared, or mainstream America, including liberals, is really never really trying to look into it. That is the collaboration of white supremacy in America and international collaboration. So white supremacy in general is understood as a bad thing, but it's a bad thing in America. But really, you think about white supremacy, it was never American creation, and the birth of white supremacy from the beginning has an international tone. It was a byproduct of colonialism. And you think about what happened in January 6th. We talked about that it was bad, that was anti-democracy, that was anti-America. But we don't really hear discussions about, do you have collaboration with foreign powers as well? Because right before January 6th, there was a long period of time of the uprising of white supremacy in Europe, especially in East Europe, in Poland, right, in Czech Republic, in Ukraine. But we don't talk about that. We don't talk about that actually Proud Boys, a far-right white supremacy organization partially responsible for January 6th, has huge international chapters everywhere. So where is FARA going? Do we have to look into white supremacist collaboration with foreign power? Elon Musk would not only on the Twitter tell you those far-right white supremacy stuff, he would actually participate in political movement in Europe to collaborate with white supremacists, and then come to America and tell you that is a good idea. If you think Elon Musk should be registered under FARA, and he was accused for many, many things, but almost nobody would tell us that Elon Musk needs to be checked under FARA. So people of color's allegiances, loyalty to America, is in the constant trend to be checked. But white people, even collaborating with white supremacy, is having attacks. Charlie Kirk was portrayed by a big liberal as that he was practicing politics in the right way. That is a very different type of racialization. Oh, and also another thing that nobody can really rationale or even don't want to talk about is AIPAC, right? AIPAC is the most powerful foreign lobbying group in America, and what AIPAC is doing is squarely into the realm of FARA. But until just today, AIPAC is still not registered on the FARA, and the reason has never been really clarified. But it's been really clear that anybody who dares to speak too loud against AIPAC is in the danger of being doxxed. So I wanted to talk about the why, and if we can have a theory to understand why we have this racialized allegiances, why white people's allegiances is usually unchecked, even when they collab with white supremacy, but the people of color's interest has been always constantly being on the check. I'm trying to borrow Derek Abell's interest convergence theory to have the explanation. So in my last paper, I created this theory called the interest diverge theory. The question is, okay, we understand that people of color's interests will only be advanced when their interests converge with white people. But what if their interest is divergence in divergence concord with the mainstream white America? Does that mean that their interest is going to just stall and not advance? My argument is that no. When their people of color's interest diverging from mainstream white American, not only their interest will be stalled, their basic right will be taken away. My last paper was about Chinese people and the revival of alien land law. Their property, Chinese immigrants' property rights are being taken away by 22 states right now. Why? Because Chinese immigrants' interests are in divergence concourse with mainstream America's anti-China sentiment. Now here, for Muslims in Michigan, the story is the same. Think about the entire system of our democracy system. American democracy system is American capitalism democracy system. That system, the thriving, is going to be dependent on America's ability to gatekeeping means of production and to assert dominance globally so that you have enough resource to reproduce product and then add values and sell products or ideas to the world. And that idea, that entire structure, promotes a dual system, a dual right system, or two-faced America, as Villanova says. That domestically we're supporting a process-based, right-based system. But outside America, we support a black forest system, anything goes in the name of America. And that structure is very forceful and is enough to attract almost all conservatives and the vast majority of liberals to co-sign that system. But when you think about Muslims in Michigan, their rights, their interests are in the divergence course of this dual system. Because internationally, they cannot endorse this black forest system because they actually have family members get compromised and even killed in whatever happened in Gaza right now. It's inhumane to ask people in that community to support a politician who's going to become silent on that clear genocidal situation. And domestically, brown people, especially Muslims, they are not the direct beneficiaries of the right-based equality domestic sphere. They are not the direct, especially after 9/11, they actually became the targets of a lot of local, state, and federal level of criminal justice system situation. So their interests are in the diverged course of mainstream America. That means their right, their exercise of democracy, their exercise of voting now is on the constant check by mainstream America. So my last point is, what are we supposed to be doing, supposed to do about this? I think I'm really glad I'm in this conference because this conference gives me a lot of thoughts. I think the first thought is that multiracial democracy from the beginning, since we do not have a definition right now, I think multiracial democracy, if we have to define that as a crowd of CRS scholars, it has to be something that is baked in international justice from the beginning. It cannot be an afterthought. It cannot be that, oh, we have to build our domestic equality, democracy first, then cherry on the top, international justice. Because that system creates a crowd of people that will tell you that, well, I am democracy, I am an American, I'm pro-democracy except for Palestine. There should be no such thing. You cannot support a equal protection-based system domestically than just support basically no rights for brown people on the international justice. And those two things are linked together. I like this one paragraph, one sentence by Angela Davis. She said, the struggle against racism, policing, and the prison industrial complex in the United States is inseparable from the struggle against US militarism and imperialism abroad. We cannot compartmentalize justice, it must be global. Everything works in a circle. Whatever happened outside, very, very often circles back to America. One example, NYPD practically sent their officers to Israel on taxpayers' money to get training. And why? they need to send officers to Israel to learn how they treat brown people so that they can come back and use the same techniques to treat brown and black people. Whatever happened outside doesn't always stay outside. It comes back to inside as well. And one thing that I think people on the left can do is to actually look at what happened in your neighborhood and think about the connection between what happened in your neighborhood and the potential connection with international justice. I definitely oppose those what we call supreme break international justice warrior. Whenever we talk about international justice, the first thing we talk about is, oh, international, ICJ, right? We need to go to the International Court of Justice, have someone arrested. Justice happens in your neighborhood. Ask yourself, what kind of politician you are supporting to become the leader of your neighborhood? I think it's time especially young Americans are getting more and more aware of the connection between international justice and domestic justice. One example is Zoran Mondani in New York. I think that is a very inspirational, a very positive trend that I can see, that he is a politician that is able to build into international justice mentality into his race in a mayor competition, and it's very, very well received. And one last thing I wanted to speak is from the a professor's perspective. I think there needs to be more mobility between law professors to really check what is your institute is doing to your colleague, for those colleagues who actually spoke out, say, against Israel's genocidal actions in Gaza, because a lot of scholars are not doing so well. I think, I don't know, many of you know that LPE director at Yale Law School basically had to self-deport herself because she was doxxed by Yale with the collaboration of a law firm, then for speaking out against the genocidal situation. And I don't remember, I see a lot of pushback from Yale Law School, and she was just quietly doxxed and just self-deported. So there needs to be a lot of mobility in our community as well. So that is my presentation.
So I'm going to invite all of our speakers back to the table here in the front, and we'll open up our I want to encourage our panelists to dialogue with each other, and I was thinking of opening up by asking them to comment on each other's papers, but I think we prefer to first go to the public, but keep that in mind among yourselves. If you have comments or questions for your fellow panelists, I think it would be interesting to have that dialogue at some point between you. But let's go straight to our public here, and thank you again for coming. Really, you can start off with any of the presentations, and we'll take, if it's all right with you, shall we take like 2 or 3 interventions and then go around each of you answering them if they're addressed to you? Okay, we have one. Go ahead.
Good morning. I enjoyed your presentations. I was a bit late, so I didn't catch all of them. My name is Ahimia Mpopo-Anti. I'm based at SciFac in Johannesburg in South Africa. I'm working on another project, which is climate reparations. And basically, I think what I've been thinking about a lot is you're all talking about colonialism, and of course the links between colonialism and capitalism. But what do you think reparations look like in the context of addressing colonialism and capitalism, especially from an economic perspective? Because it seems that a lot of the remedies have been based on increasing political freedom and political rights, even though we have situations like Palestine where even that is not allowed. But the whole question of economic justice and economic reform, what do you think that looks like? And I know that's a big question, but I've just been thinking about that a lot. What does repair look like in colonialism and capitalism?
Good, great.
again, say your name as you did, say your name.
Anniv Zhang. I recently finished a clerkship with the Superior Court. I was part of practice for 10 years. I have a question for Natasha. Could you give us an example of how corporate structure, maybe business law, aligns with colonialism? I mean, to me, colonialism is just profit by theft. Like, I mean, not to be blunt, that's just what it means. But I'm curious how, through your lens, how the various interests and stakeholders support colonialism and more specifically colonial capitalism.
Sure.
And one more?
Yes, my name is Justin Hansford. I'm a law professor at Howard University. And this question is actually similar to the gentleman's right here. I'm working on a conference on reparations and decolonialism in the law, actually in Johannesburg next year. So I'm very interested in trying to understand remedies and repair for the colonial harms that you described, and what they would look like, and what sorts of legal projects could be part of a project of repair using the law. So I'm not sure if you usually think about structures like corporate harms, talked about FARA. I'm not sure if you've thought about what types of remedies are available legally for those harms, and how do we think about harm in a collective way as opposed to individuals who are harmed. How do we have collective remedies for these harms?
Great. So let's open it up to the panelists. There are obviously two questions that are interrelated on reparations. I don't know if anyone wants to begin commenting on
Can I
either.
take the first one? 'Cause
Oh,
I
we
think
can
it
do that.
might
All right.
start responding
Okay,
to the second one.
that's a good idea.
Okay, so you asked, I think, to sort of give an example of colonial capitalism, and you, I think, used the phrase, you think of colonialism as profit
By theft.
by theft. Yes, that's what I wrote, profit by theft. So I have this one, there's so many sort of historical examples, but last year was the 40th anniversary of the Union Carbide. There was in Bhopal, India, there was an explosion, a gas leak explosion. There was, Union Carbide was the multinational corporation. They're now Dow Chemical, which is alive and well. And they decided that they were going to, I'm going to shortcut this, manufacture a chemical in Bhopal, India, and they used, they sort of decided that they could shortcut some of the safety precautions because they didn't value, there are corporate records to this effect. They didn't value sort of the workers or the human lives. They didn't, the way that they dealt with their safety precautions in that space in India was really different than they would have dealt with it anywhere else in the world. And maybe it was because of the population was bigger, or they value, like there was literally, there's records about how they valued the people either that worked at Union Carbide or in the surrounding area. There was even sort of, well, if there was something that went wrong and something exploded, it would be bad for this radius of the surrounding community. And even the justification, well, but if we do this, then it's gonna have this really significant cost savings for us. So here's your connection to profit by theft, right? It's not quite a theft. I mean, some people will say that's not theft, but it's, I'm gonna take advantage of this sort of low cost. And then, what happened was there was a gas, it was entirely predictable. They pushed a system past its breaking point. There was a gas leak. The entire town of Bhopal and surrounding, thousands of people, there's still effects today. And it's connected to sort of reparations because there are still people who, there were many people who were blinded, many people who lost their lives. Generations later, there are effects. And there were, thank you, there's some sort of they tried to sort of connect, they worked with the Indian government, they worked with, the CEO was extradited, there was really no corporate accountability. So for me, this is an example of the ways that things like the structure of the corporation, the limits of liability, the sort of the internal controls, the protocols, there was a failure at every corporate level of accountability. And then Now we're in this situation, last year on the sort of 40th anniversary, there were a bunch of Netflix, if the algorithm identified you, you might have gotten like a lot of Netflix. Look up Bhopal, India, and then you'll see a lot of, how do we repair that? Somebody said yesterday, I can't remember in what panel, reparations are about more than money. It's not just the money, right? And I hear that, I do. I promise you that I do. There has to be something more than money, but I am someone who thinks that the money is actually pretty important, right? I think that when you are on the ground, when you are someone who is living in Bhopal and you have lost your ability to work, or you have lost someone who is the only one who can work, right? That the money, the ability to support your family, right? When I teach corporate law, I think about why people engage in enterprise, and it is to support their families. So I actually think that the money is pretty important. And so being able to quantify that, while it will never be alone adequate, is pretty important. That's one of many answers to your questions. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I would say maybe in the interest of time,
Yeah, sorry.
now that you kind of addressed initially that question and entered into the theme of reparations, let's see if the other panelists can also contribute to that, to that issue on reparations. I know dealing with land, dealing with language and culture, dealing with kind of globalized racial hierarchies as you did, you know, how, do any of you have any comments on these questions of reparations?
I have one short comment is that I think, in response to what you just, like the money problem, I think from what I get from Professor Bali's claim yesterday was the pushback of reparation is usually based on money. So, the money is too much, right? You asked me to give a lot of money, but in reality, the money is there. So that is what the money is not a problem assertion from her. The money is there. The problem is that for people who have money to pay the reparation, is not used to pay that under the directive of a crowd of people who don't usually tell them what to do. And that is the problem.
Alvin, 2 points quickly. Have you read Eric Yamamoto's, any of Eric Yamamoto's work?
No, I haven't.
So he has done a lot of work with reparations, in particular with indigenous peoples, and he has, I think it's a very brief essay called The Salience of Economic Redress, and he's arguing in favor of why money reparations are actually quite powerful. And then this goes to your question too. I think, at least for like my people, for the Hawaiian people, we don't care about money, we just want our land back. And so I think that, and so I think it's like, for me at least, I always think about reparations need to be tied to the harm, and the harm was our nation was taken. So if the government would give us our land, which they still hold, if the military would give us the land that they still hold, we would be happy, well, not happy, but we'd be happier. But yeah, I'd love to talk more about that.
You got the money too.
Yeah, yes, want it all.
Alvin?
Yeah, just to say something briefly, and this is kind of like a narrow answer to the question about reparations for colonialism, at least from the perspective of my paper. So I think some forms of reparations in the US could be categorized by a conservative legal movement as a race-conscious remedy that will not survive strict scrutiny, right? So if there were like Puerto Ricans, Hawaiians, the Native Nations that were to kind of like to demand to the federal government some form of like a reparation, maybe courts will strike those down as like unconstitutional because they violate equal protection. Maybe the courts won't decide that for certain groups, but that could be a problem. So my emphasis really is on what these communities can do themselves to address their issues. Of course, they cannot address all of those issues by themselves, right? Like with regards to like Hawaiian land, that's something that very, very clearly. But I think like as part of like reparations, I think of it as a political vocabulary that might kind of like unsettle some of these ideas about equality that we have, right? So even if these policies might be struck down, hopefully they kind of like politicize some of these debates about land and housing and our relationship to land in particular. So yeah, that's really the answer to the question, but that's how it connects to kind of like my paper.
Yeah, I think, and maybe to interject a comment on the panel and in response a bit to the question on reparations, is that a whole thread running through this conference or symposium, of course, is that colonialism or settler colonialism or anti-black racism, they're structures and not events, right? So the dominant actors who need to be held accountable to make reparations, you know, at the most view events that may represent discrimination or harm and or resist seeing these issues as product of structures of settler colonialism, which includes genocide, invisibilization of indigenous peoples, or again, structural racism that we know is embedded in the law itself. So, I mean, it is kind of the challenge as scholars and as activists to really promote that truth, you know, getting back to that discussion of truth that we had in one of the panels yesterday. It's using our skills to bring to bear that debate, societal debate, on the truth, and that these are structural realities that require reparations in a form that go beyond monetary reparations and go beyond remedying concrete harms that we see in a particular instance, but really try to transform the structures themselves. So I think we're out of time, and we want to make room for the next panel, and you all have to get to your next panel. So thank you again to our panelists here.